Early attempts by the English to colonize North America took place in what is now North Carolina. English colonists tried to settle at Roanoke 3 times in the late 1580s. They had conflicts with Native Americans and food shortages. The Roanoke settlement failed and the people vanished in 1590. Despite the failures, the English tried again. This time they landed in Chesapeake Bay. Jamestown was established in 1607 along the banks of the James River in Virginia. Early settlers struggled to survive, but local Native Americans helped them find food and live off the land. In the years that followed, more English settlers flooded Virginia. Jamestown became a permanent English settlement. The colonists originally searched for gold but didn't find any. They quickly discovered that the climate and geography of Virginia were ideal for farming. The crop that led to the success of the Virginia colony was tobacco. Colonists could sell tobacco to Europeans for needed supplies. To make more money and keep up with demand, tobacco farmers needed a large number of workers. At first, they brought indentured servants from England. Indentured servants were people who worked for a promised number of years to pay for passage to the colony. But then, in the early 1600s, English and Dutch traders brought enslaved Africans to work on plantations. By 1650, there were 300 enslaved Africans working in Virginia. The Virginia colony was started because King James I of England allowed the Virginia Company from London to colonize part of America. The Southeast at the time was rural. Most people lived miles away from neighbors. Plantation farming of tobacco was the primary source of wealth. As the Virginia colony grew and became successful, the need for government grew. The king appointed governors to carry out his wishes in the colonies. To improve relations with the Virginia colony, the king allowed the people to manage some of their own problems. So in 1619, the House of Burgesses was organized in Virginia. It was the first elected government in America. Representatives from different plantations met in the House of Burgesses and decided on laws. They met in Jamestown, the location of the first settlement. The House of Burgesses gave early colonists a role in governing themselves. The King of England became troubled by colonists having too much power and by raids by Native Americans. So he declared Virginia as a royal colony in 1624, taking control from the Virginia Company. Even though it was limited, the House of Burgesses system remained in effect in Virginia up until the Revolution. As the colony grew, it became more convenient to relocate Virginia's capital to Middle Plantation further inland. With permission from the king, Middle Plantation was renamed Williamsburg in 1699. Williamsburg was one of the first planned cities in America. The British government imposed laws on the colonists to pay for its war debts. Between 1763 and 1775, harsh taxes and laws restricted trade in the colonies. This greatly impacted Virginia, the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses organized a committee to protest the steep taxes. The governor, who was loyal to the king, tried to break up the House of Burgesses in 1774. Members continued to meet and tried to get the British to change their laws over the colonies. Patrick Henry gave a passionate speech that influenced Virginia to join the American Revolution. The Revolutionary War began when fighting broke out against the British in 1775. Delegates from the 13 colonies assembled and moved toward independence. Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian, wrote much of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This document announced that the American colonies were free to form their own nation. The Revolutionary War ended when the Continental Army defeated the British on October 19, 1781, in Yorktown, Virginia. By the time the colonies won their independence from the British, the Southeast had more than 1 million people. The agriculture of the Southeast made landowners some of the wealthiest people in the country. Settlers rushed to claim land, seeking opportunities for freedom and wealth. The Appalachian Mountains formed a geographic barrier for settlers. By the middle of the 1700s, the Piedmont region from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachians had been explored and settled. Rivers made it possible to transport people and goods in the region, but travel further west was stopped. In 1775, Daniel Boone led an expedition to find a way through the Appalachians and into the West. He uncovered a Native American trail through the Cumberland Gap in Virginia. His discovery opened territories in Kentucky and Tennessee. Settlers came from Scotland, Ireland, and Germany to settle the American frontier. These Appalachian settlements did not develop the cash crop economy found east of the mountains. By the 1780s, enslaved people made up about 40% of the population of the Southeast. Plantation owners in the Southeast used enslaved people to do labor. As settlers moved west, they took their enslaved people with them. Not all African Americans were enslaved. Some escaped or bought their freedom and looked for places to start their lives as free men and women. After the colonies won their independence from the British, areas in the Southeast were still controlled by other European countries. For example, the Spanish had settlements in Florida. Regional cultures developed from the mixing of people in different territories. Louisiana was claimed by both France and Spain at different times. A group called Creoles lived near New Orleans. The Creole culture developed from a blend of the region's French, Spanish, and African peoples. In South Carolina and Georgia, people called the Gula had their own regional culture. Most of the Gula people were from Sierra Leone in Africa. Europeans enslaved and brought the Gula to the southeast to work on plantations. The Atlantic coastal plain where they settled was isolated from the rest of the region. This allowed the Gula people to retain much of their African culture and language. Native American groups also lived and traded throughout the southeast. The Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole nations sometimes fought settlers moving into their lands. However, they also worked and traded together. Frontier settlers often adopted ways of living from the Native American groups. The fertile soil and long growing season made the Southeast ideal for growing crops. Agriculture was the main industry during the 1700s. Plantation farming. Cash crops were grown on huge farms called plantations. A single plantation could be more than 1,000 acres in size and have hundreds of people working on it. In the 1700s, the work was done by enslaved Africans. Tobacco was the first cash crop grown on plantations. By the 1700s, tobacco plantations were found across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. The wetlands of South Carolina and Georgia were used for rice plantations. The enslaved Gula people knew how to make rice grow in the marshes. Indigo, used for expensive blue dye, was also grown in South Carolina. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793. The cotton gin was a machine that separated cotton fibers from its seeds much faster than could be done by hand. Use of the cotton gin allowed plantation owners to keep up with the high demand for cotton from textile factories in the Northeast and Europe. By 1803, cotton was the leading cash crop in the United States. To grow more cotton, plantation owners used more enslaved people and took more land from Native Americans. Plantation farming and the wealth generated by plantations would not have been possible without the huge number of enslaved people who planted and harvested the crops. The unjust and cruel system of slavery began in the American colonies in 1619 when more than 20 enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown. By the 1790s, more than half the people living in Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas were enslaved and working on plantations. Small farms. Even though there are many plantations in the Southeast, most of the land in the region was owned by yeoman farmers. Yeomen owned small areas of land and worked on the farms with their families. These small farms produced grains, fruits, and vegetables. The food and livestock were used by the families and sold locally. Small yeoman farms had few or no enslaved people, but many yeoman farmers still supported slavery. Yeomen represented the largest group of farmers. In the mid-1700s, colonies such as Virginia offered land grants to encourage people to settle new territories. The frontier land near the Appalachian Mountains was mostly settled by poor European farmers who immigrated to America. Many started as indentured servants
No,
and
sir.
moved west when their contracts were paid. Frontier farmers were isolated, and they only grew what they needed to live. In the 1700s, transportation in the Southeast was difficult and dangerous. There were very few roads, therefore, the most reliable way to travel was by boat. Waterways connected the vast rural landscape of the Southeast with other colonies. Farmers shipped crops down rivers to market. Ships then carried goods to Europe and the Caribbean to sell. British colonists settled in South Carolina in 1670. They named their settlement Charlestown, which was later shortened to Charleston. By 1740, the port at Charleston was the busiest in the Southeast. It was critical to the plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, shipping tobacco, rice, lumber, and cotton for trade. New Orleans was the major port city of the French territory of Louisiana. It was controlled by Spain from 1763 to 1802. New Orleans is located where the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. The port was a vital trade center for people transporting goods to and from the Mississippi Valley. The invention of the steamship in 1787 further boosted the economy of the Southeast. Steamships were large boats that used steam engines to power through the water. They could sail up and down rivers quickly, carrying huge loads of goods and people. Before steamships, flat-bottomed barges were used to carry goods down rivers. They were not able to sail back up rivers. Steamships allowed plantation owners to move cash crops to port cities in a matter of days. They also connected the region's waterways for people to travel more easily. Steamships on the Mississippi River carried settlers into the Mississippi Territory. In 1795, the United States and Spain signed Pinckney's Treaty. This treaty allowed Americans to travel freely up the Mississippi River. It also gave American merchants a permanent place in the port of New Orleans to bring goods to be exported. Steamships ruled the Mississippi River in the 1800s. They provided a fast and comfortable way to travel. By 1811, steamships could freely travel from Ohio all the way to the port of New Orleans.